Hello, good morning and welcome to today's Leaders Live event, which is titled Under the Bonnet. As we enter the EV transition, how do they actually work? Now today, this is a hybrid event, which does not mean it is a mix of internally combusted and electric things. It means that I have, excitingly, actual people in an actual room with me, yet we are also joined remotely by another esteemed panellist. Now I'll come to those in a moment, but let me just run you through how it's going to work over the next hour or so. First of all, the panellists are all going to tell you a little bit about themselves. Then there'll be a technology showcase from Bosch, and then we'll be into the meat of the panel discussion, which includes questions from me to the panellists. My name's Matt Pryor. I work at Autocar magazine, but I also want to hear from you as we go through as well. We will get your questions here, and I can put those to the rest of the panellists as well. Now, as well as your questions, we also have a Mentimeter poll for you to get involved with, which the details are on the screen now. There are 3 questions that we'll deal with over the next hour. But first of all, let me introduce the panellists to you. They are Heiko Weller, remotely from Germany. He's the Senior Vice President for Electric Axles and Motors. And next to me in the room here in London are Rajesh Darji, who is the Vice President of Sales Cross-Domain Computing Solutions at Bosch, and Peter Wooding, who is the Chief Executive Officer from 360, and he is the Chief Content Officer of Automotive EV. So first of all, Raj, welcome, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. If we think about the purpose of mobility, we all want to make driving safer, more sustainable, and most of all exciting. And if we think about then the technologies which will enable this purpose and feed the purpose, certainly for us at Bosch, we think the core technologies around software and services, connectivity, personalization, and then the big topics around automation and what we're going to be discussing today, electrification. Now, for us, those are not discrete pillars of technology, but more of a, let's say, interconnected ecosystem where there is a lot of dependency on one another. So for today's panel, I'm really excited to maybe explore some of those interdependencies on the take-up and, exploitation and introduction of EV cars into the market.
Thanks, Raj. Peter, tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Matt. My name is Peter Wooding. As Matt introduced, I represent 360 and Automotive EV. As a company, we focus on the entire automotive supply chain, including, obviously, electric vehicles. Literally from the mine all the way through to ultimately the customer and all the associated challenges and opportunities that there are in between. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Peter. Heiko, thanks for joining us from Germany. I think you'd like to introduce yourself, and then you have a technology showcase to show us too.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yes, true. So I will get into more what I'm working on currently in a little bit. But Heiko Weller, 25 years with Bosch, mainly in the powertrain area over the years. Worked some years on gasoline engines and recently also on diesel and hybrids. And I have been also a couple of years under my belt already on electric vehicles because I worked on the research side of things at Bosch 10 years ago already on electric vehicles. Currently are responsible for electric motors and electric axles here with Bosch in Germany.
Super, thanks.
So
do you want to introduce the next part of your intro, which is a technology showcase of what Bosch is offering at the moment?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. So what I will do the next 10 minutes is give you a glance on what Bosch's approach is on the electrification technology, but I want to start with the market and actually first of all want to give you an insight on what Bosch's philosophy on this is. So when you think of powertrain solutions, and this is the organization that I'm working for, is that we have a very diverse way of approaching this. We think that the powertrain the next couple of years will be still existing of combustion engines, gasoline, diesel. We will see a great share of hybrids coming into the market, starting with mild hybrid 48-volt systems, going more into strong hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and then electric vehicles, but also fuel cell a very important role, maybe more on the commercial vehicle side than on the passenger car side for the next 10 years as we foresee it. But we believe in it all, and this is what I think is important to us, because we think that, like Raj said earlier, mobility is playing a huge role in our life, and it will continue to play a huge role. And if we do look at the last almost 20, 30 years, we had a year-to-year increase in personal mobility and commercial mobility in the range between 3 to 3.5% year-to-year increase, which led us into this CO2 footprint that we're leaving with the Earth right now. And if you just look at Europe, we in the transportation sector, we increased since 1990 the output on CO2 by roughly 1.1 billion tons. I think this is no longer acceptable. The CO2 debate and the climate acts over the world are foreseeing a different plan, so we have to act here too. And there is solutions out there. They're carbon neutral, and I will get to those in a second here. However, I will also say from a combustion engine perspective, we have done our homework, because we are looking pretty good now in terms of emissions output of the latest vehicles that we put on the road. You probably remember the debate of nitrogen emissions here in the UK and in Europe. Currently, we are only exceeding nitrogen limits in the cities, and only 4% of all stations that in Europe are currently placed. And we have gone let's say from a challenge to a solution here. Going now a little bit more into the powertrain diversity, I give you a quick insight in what the market will look like, the way we think it is. And honestly, this is a bit funny story, because 10 years ago, and that was in 2010, I forecasted the electrification share in the global market by roughly 3%. And oh my God, was Bosch being challenged with that number, because a conservative German company forecasting such low numbers, and why are we not thinking that the electrification has a future? Honestly, it may have been a coincidence, but we ended up, as you know, globally with roughly 4% of EVs on the road in 2020, so not much far off. And then same share in hybrids and mild hybrids. So 444 is a number that is for 2020 that you can keep in mind. 4% BEVs, 4% strong hybrids and plug-in hybrids, and 4% mild hybrids. Now this will change significantly through the CO2 regulations that we have in all regions, starting with Europe as being the strongest and toughest, and then following China and North America. With the new elected president there, we see also there is a significant move towards CO2 neutrality, and so we will also see that something will have to change from that end of the world. So in 2025, we're looking at an increase to 11% of battery electric vehicles on the road. Roughly, again, the same share of hybrids, strong hybrid and plug-in hybrid, and roughly the same share of mild hybrids. So you see already a significant change. And now if we are jumping into 2030, this picture makes your head spin a little bit, because at that point, we're ending up between 20 to 30% of battery electric vehicles in passenger car area. Also, the fuel cell technology will enter by that point by a small number. Hybrids are playing still a significant role at that point, and mild hybrids are basically almost standard in some regions for supporting the combustion engine. Now, if you go back 10, 20 years, we never have seen such a quick change in the market. So that will be a challenge for all of us in the industry, supplier industry, sub-supplier industry, for the competence that we bring in the engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So you can just imagine that this is going to be very challenging. Now at Bosch, we believe the electrification is a necessity for CO2 countermeasure, and that's why the battery electric vehicle market is forecasted from our side with these high numbers. What are we bringing into this? We actually have a very broad approach in electrification, and we are starting from the smallest pieces that you can think of, actually currently heavily discussed chips. We have semiconductors that we're building. We are believing that silicium will be replaced by lithium carbide pretty quickly here because the efficiency is better. So we're working on that end, going into building inverters, electric motors, entire electric axles, and also actually integrating these electric axles then into platforms that we using as rolling chassis to put also on the market. So as you see, we're approaching this very broadly, and I brought you some little mock-ups here that can give you a glance on what we're talking about. So this is a scale 1 to 4 model of an electric axle, and the original one here is carrying 150 kilowatts with it. They're typically very good in the torque level, as you know. And I will explain that a little bit to you. What we're seeing here, we have the inverter on the top side of the electric axle. And on the back side here, the motor attached very closely to it. And then a gearbox that then transforms with typically a 1 to 10 gear ratio, the torque into the axle. And here you can see the axle that is producing then the torque to the wheels. Why I did bring this model, the original one would weigh around 85 kilograms, so not easy for me to hold that. It gives you an idea of how this will look. It is then integrated like this directly into the vehicle. I brought a second model that we will currently building on. It's a little bit earlier mock-up here. It's a bit bigger, but the scale is 1 to 2. So now imagine 1 to 2 is not very big, right? And 1 to 4 people sometimes have problems to imagine the size of that, but 1 to 2 is just double what I have in my hand. This is the smallest axle that we are currently building. It is starting around 50 kilowatts, going up to 100 kilowatt. It is much lighter. It's only 50 kilograms when it's built and integrated. And it is used in city vehicles, smaller electric vehicles, and also used, and we're seeing some success here from our side in acquisition, as boost axle. What is a boost axle? It's a second electric axle. So the main electric drive is an electric axle, and the second one for all-wheel drive vehicles. You guys in the UK know Jaguar Land Rover, for example, has always all-wheel drive on the Land Rover side of things. If you want to go all electric, you need a second electric axle. So you could have put a smaller electric axle as a second boost axle. Same philosophy here, maybe even higher integrated. You see the inverter on top, the motor here on the bottom, and then the gearbox on the side of things. So at that point, I would like to ask the UK team to start a little clip, then we can see how this is going to get integrated into a vehicle. So this is the small city EV that I mentioned just now. This is the smallest electric propulsion system that we're working on. You see the charging system here. We have charging system solutions, of course, also available that I did not lean on too much just now, but we have, of course, the onboard chargers. Here you see the e-axle that I just had in hand, moving this city electric vehicle along. It is connected and integrated in an overall system here. You see the battery in the middle, and then in the back there was the charger that we're having a closer look just now on. It is all connected to a vehicle control unit that you see here, also in the vehicle. We believe in high system integration. We have been working on highly integrated systems since many, many years on combustion engines. Same approach that we do here on electric vehicles. And now this I brought for the UK folks. We're having, of course, not the small city vehicles. We're also working on sports cars, as you know. And I worked out of the UK for Aston Martin from Bosch side and McLaren, also Lotus. Very exciting always is for us also the sports cars. There we have also solutions. And here you will see this idea of the boost axle that also being used on sports cars. Here's the control unit, the vehicle control unit that steers, so to say, the axle. It delivers the driver's request torque then to the axle. And in this case, as I said, 2 axles in the system, as you can see here now. The second axle in the front, which is the boost axle that I just have been describing. So great solutions, I guess, for the sports car industry as well. And this is actually our approach. We're having solutions from small electric vehicles, like I've just shown, all the way into sports cars, all the way into commercial vehicle, light commercial vehicles, and heavy duty trucks. All that we do. So what does electrification mean to Bosch? Highly system integrated solutions I already talked about. We have also some successes. We are already equipped 2.5 million vehicles that are currently on the road with our solutions. So we're not a new starter in the electrification area. We have been working very much on cost innovation because we believe that only cost optimized solutions will be the future in this industry, because we have to compete, of course, against the more classical powertrain in one way, and we have a lot of new competitors coming in, names, competitors to Bosch, names that we haven't even heard before. So we have to be cost optimized here. And we are working on the infrastructure. I mentioned that earlier as well, because the three things that make an electric vehicle at the end a success is the range that the vehicle has, the cost the vehicle has, and at the end, an infrastructure that it gets feed from. And all these three things have to come together. We are addressing as Bosch all three of these pillars to make electrification a success in the market. What we should not being hiding under the carpet or sweeping under the carpet is, of course, it brings a different challenge also into the industry. As I said earlier, we have to change our approach, how we working on this, because at the end, from a Bosch side, we see that from a workforce, we need much less people to bring these electrification solutions on the road than, for example, on a combustion engine. Combustion engine had many pieces. Actually, in total, 1,200 parts that Bosch produced for combustion engines. And then e-powertrain only has roughly 200 parts. That the axle that I've just shown you is very simple. The simple gearbox is one electric motor and inverter. So less parts needs less people, needs less workforce. And maybe a number I want to send you away with here that you also should think of. We're currently counting for 10 people that we would need for diesel system to put on a road, to only 3 people in gasoline area. That always has been that way because it has been less complex from an exhaust gas after treatment perspective, to only 1 person in scaling that we would need on electrification for an e-axle. So you see that is also putting a lot of pressure on a company that comes more from the classical business. At the end, it only makes sense for us if we do this to have a carbon neutrality that we are addressing with this, because this is the only way why we're doing the electrification anyways, is for local emissions. And I said already, the combustion engine has been improving much in that area. So it comes down to CO2. But currently the industry, automotive industry, only looks at CO2 at the drive cycle itself. How much is the vehicle producing in CO2, the drive cycle? Now, if you assume the battery is charged and you go on a dyno, a test dyno, of course, the battery electric vehicle will be CO2 neutral and will be counted like that also in the calculation from a regulation perspective. But this is not what we think from Bosch side is the right philosophy. You might have heard of scope 1, 2, 3. The drive cycle itself is actually only scope 2. Scope 1 is how do we produce this vehicle and how do we develop the vehicle is also CO2, has a CO2 footprint. We are addressing this as Bosch since last year as CO2 neutral. All of our locations globally are CO2 neutral, developing and producing. And the scope 3 is what is the entire life cycle about it? Where do actually the energy come from? Where is the energy used to produce parts that we then later on manufacturing, and also the recycling all the way of end of life of the vehicle. This also has to be looked at. So my last message here is, if we want to address CO2, and that's why we do electrification, we should do it right. We should address the entire life cycle of such a battery electric vehicle, how it's produced, what kind of energy is it using, how efficient it is on the road, and at the end, also the recycling piece of it and end of life. And with this, Matt, I would hand back to you. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Heiko. We will come back to a number of those points, I think, during the next half hour or so. But let's move on to our first discussion topic that we've got. You touched on it slightly, Heiko, there, that we're on about 4% on each of hybrid PHEV and full EV. How do you think, Raj, we'll start with you, how do you think EV take-up has been affected, if at all, by the last year or so's COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, no, great topic, and certainly very present. We've all experienced a change in how we're doing things over the past 18 months or so. And I think what we've got to look at is what changes it have made in the way that we move around, yeah? How we got from A to B. I suspect that those who had private vehicles, that had their own vehicles, will tend to be using those private vehicles more to, reduce exposure, not to have so many contact with other people. I also suspect that those who are using public transport may be looking for other means of transport, maybe doing more walking, maybe more cycling, possibly even e-bikes. But then the overall, let's say, desire to move from, let's say, the internal combustion engine to a more hybrid or more fully electrified vehicle, I'm not sure it has had such a significant impact. Maybe the next years will tell us when we see the data coming out about vehicle sales and whether we go from more than 11% registrations that we've had in last year of plug-in electric vehicles, be it hybrid or full electric, whether we see that increasing at the same rate that we expect over the next few years.
Thanks. Yep. Peter, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yes, thanks, Matt. I think it's made us more aware of what we should be looking for the future, but obviously it hasn't had the impact that people thought. Probably from a negative side, it actually reduced the thought process for car sharing because of the wanting to be safe and stay within our own vehicle. But it has opened up the mindset to actually be moving forward. And there's a long way to go, but listening to the technology is growing all the time. So we're actually getting closer towards it.
Thanks. Well, so far, the majority of you think that the pandemic has accelerated the transition towards EVs, but not by a huge amount. About 30% of you think that there isn't a great deal of change at all, and just a quarter of you think that it has slowed the transition slightly. Heiko, from a more global perspective and looking towards the future as well, do you think that the way people's lives have changed, the way their lifestyles have changed, will make much of a difference to EV take-up has made any difference over the past year, and whether you think it will in the next couple of years?
Yeah, maybe first of all to the question of the pandemic pushing electric vehicle and electric mobility. I personally don't really see the connection there so much. The year 2020, we all knew in Europe is going to be a decisive year because of the new CO2 regulation with the 95 grams CO2 per kilometer kicked in, and the OEMs had to deliver solutions, made a huge difference. Incentives are being put out, which of course at the end consumer says, I'm rather taking this with me. The mindset has changed. I think this entire move towards a better perception of what CO2 does to our planet has entered the end consumer. And I have a rather funny story from my personal surrounding environment. A friend of mine was driving a rather big SUV with a strong engine in it, and the kids made him to think different. He's driving now a plug-in hybrid, and he's pretty happy about it. He made their family happy, and still driving an SUV, and he's not getting pressure from the environment, from his family and friends. And I think this shows me that something has changed.
Yeah, it's there's also the upcoming UN climate change conference, COP26, as well. Do you expect to see announcements from car companies ahead of that or around that, taking that into account, given the heightened awareness, as you say, from family? It seems to have entered people's general consciousness far more so than it has in the past. Do you expect manufacturers to ramp up their announcements around the climate change conference?
I think so, yes. The pressure is out. The industry has felt the pressure over years, as I said, coming in to 2020, where we had to act in Europe especially, and that's where we say that the takeoff is currently happening. China was ahead of the game anyways because of other regulations there and incentives. And I think it will be, the answer will come from the OEMs, also to bring this into public, into solutions that they will bring into the showroom, and also to conferences like you just mentioned. I think it is, like our CEO, Mr. Danner, said, electrification is no longer a bet on the future. It is happening.
Yeah, Peter, that's true, isn't it? And you sort of think that with disruptive new manufacturers and new technologies as well, the sort of legacy manufacturers will have to keep up with it too.
Well, they have to keep up. I think they want to keep up more, but also I believe they need to cooperate more across the entire sector, so there's a better understanding of how working together, whether it be infrastructure people, whether it be governmental, whether it be energy, they've got to take some of the stress away from the OEM. It can't be just them driving it all on their own.
Yeah. Raj, your thoughts on this?
I think there's a couple of points, right? There's legislation that's going to drive the need. There's an absolute need because legislation says that we have to move in a certain direction to reduce emissions, as Heiko had pointed out. I think the other element that will also accelerate this is that this pressure that the traditional OEMs have seen has come from some really exciting products on the market. And if the traditional OEMs want to remain relevant, they've also got to bring exciting products to the market. So I think it's going to be a combination of both the legislative part of it and also competitiveness, where we'll see a higher uptake and introduction of really, really exciting technologies coming into the market pretty soon.
Do you think, is there another tipping point coming up, do you think? Is there a new technology tipping point that will get hesitant customers in tune with what's coming?
Well, I think it also comes back to what Heiko said, the three elements. We've got to think about the cost element, the range element, and the infrastructure element. And any tipping point has to address that. If the total cost of ownership of running an EV is greater than, let's say, the traditional vehicle that people have today, then the tipping point will come later. If we don't have the charging infrastructure in the UK to enable the consumer to charge their vehicle up in a homogeneous way wherever they are in the country, it will push the tipping point back. So I think there are several factors that need to be addressed before we'll see that massive take-up.
Yeah. Peter, what's your thoughts on whether there's a tipping point coming and what the factors might be that push it further or closer?
I think there's always going to be different tipping points. To me, the biggest challenge for people is feeling confident enough regard to infrastructure. Customers don't want to have to change the way that they drive. They're going to change a little, but it shouldn't be a massive change. People are used to being able to have 5 minutes in a fuel station and driving out with a 400-mile range. That's not going to happen. But they also need to have that level of confidence. And to me, price is obviously an issue, but to feel comfortable that they can use the car when they want to use it, how they want to use it. So it's infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Heiko. You've, as you mentioned earlier, you've done some of the numbers going forward to 2025 and 2030 and so on. Do you see any technology tipping points or infrastructure tipping points between now and then that will drive consumer adoption?
Yeah, the infrastructure was just mentioned. I think hand in acting, like Raj described it, is very important. Because only if the two come along, it will happen. I mean, if there are no electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids on the road, why build an infrastructure? If there's no infrastructure, then it will be hard to move these vehicles around and charge them. So it has to come on both sides. I don't want to point at government here and push it away from the automotive industry. I think though that we're doing our part. We have solutions out there. We have been making great success and having much higher efficient systems. The battery price has been coming down significantly. I think the automotive industry is ready. Infrastructure is a bit lagging right now in some areas. And as I said, both has to be coming along. A tipping point would be, of course, if someone would foresee a complete new technology in any of the areas. Right now, we don't foresee that. We're working on generation planning on motors, inverters, and we are working also with the industry that produces battery energy storage systems, and they're making big success or huge success rates in the past 10 years. I think they will continue to do so, making good progress. I don't see this, so to say, this complete leap tipping point. The tipping point is happening, like Raj said, once we have the cost parity to the more traditional combustion engine technology vehicles. If the end consumer sees a cost benefit and the infrastructure is there for them to use it, it will be, however, and I don't want that we are hiding this, it will be an adjustment for the end consumer. Like it was mentioned just now, I'm getting gas in 3 minutes. This will not happen. In many cases, you will have to take, like I'm doing myself, take that cable out in the morning and put it back in your car, or in the evening, or the other way around, wherever you charge. You have that cable in your hand minimum twice a day, and this is what the end consumer will at the end have to get used to.
Yeah, thanks. And we talk about infrastructure there, and how much you just touched on how much government or should be responsible for it. What it strikes me is that if you are refueling an ICE car, government plays basically very little part in that at all. It's all private investment that gets your car charged and so on and so forth. Will private companies ultimately have to drive the infrastructure along as we go? I mean, I suppose there is the slight issue, which we'll touch on a minute in our UK guys here, where people who cannot charge at home might be left to local councils to support it. But generally, Heiko, do you think that it's private business that drives infrastructure rather than government bodies?
Yeah, we looked at this since many years. The government will have to get involved no matter what, because I don't know how it works in the UK, but I'm comparing it to Germany. Where you put the charge station is typically on the sidewalks, and those are governmental owned anyways, or is at least governmental land. So they have to get involved no matter what, to opening up space, to make parking spaces capable of charging ready. Private companies running charging stations works in many areas already. Once they can have access to those points, we have our energy providers here running most of the charging stations, and they will get their money back through the kilowatt hours that you push through that charge station. However, that is also a business that has to be closely looked at, because you need to be rather putting a lot of energy through to get your money back. So break even for those companies is in the future, and it is not like a 2 to 3 year payback period.
Okay. Raj, do you want to expand on that a bit from a UK point?
Yeah, from a UK perspective, I mean, we can talk all about, the amount of charges that we need, and it's clear that if we want to achieve the targets for the 2030 that we talked about, set by the government, that we're certainly going to need more charges than we do today. But I think the other element of that is how we use technology to help the consumer adapt to that. Yeah, it's how do we use connectivity in a sense of helping the user or the driver of an electric vehicle know where they can charge their vehicle, to know that when they do pull up to a charging spot, that they can access it at a certain time, that if they go from one charging spot to another, that there's a homogeneous back-end system that allows them to connect, to pay, to transact for the charging itself, to plan journeys and plan trips. It's coming back to that mindset change about adapting our behavior around using electric vehicles. So I think the charging infrastructure will come. It's going to be a necessity, and whether it's done by government incentivization, or pure private companies investing. Probably a combination of both, but it's then also the back-end services that we can really exploit through connectivity, and connectivity is around us. We can do everything for our mobile phones. That's already being implemented directly into the vehicle. So it's enabling the consumer to do more than what they're doing today, and we can do that. We've got the technology to do so.
Yeah, thanks. We've touched on this a bit already, haven't we, Peter? Is the adjustment to people's the way they use cars. Is that an inevitability? Do you think there is an inevitability that people will use EVs differently to how they've been using internally combusted cars up till now?
I think there's still a resistance to actually want to achieve to do that. I believe that we should be able to use technology to bridge the gap more. You know, there are a lot of people who would have an electric vehicle that has absolutely nowhere to charge it other than a limited numbers within a town or whatever. So we're going to have to ramp up, in my opinion, on-street charging. Now, whether the on-street charging is utilising, how do they call it, the sort of, well, anyway, lampposts or whatever it is to actually do it. So that's an opportunity. But there are a lot of places, even in London, where people can afford an EV that actually do not have a drive. And you don't want to be coming home and not be able to charge. So it does need to be more software linked, so you've got your app, but it also wants to be fairly close. I said earlier, I would like to see more on-ground charging points across each, wireless charging, so that there is always an opportunity somewhere for people to do it. Yes, there is a tremendous expense, but that will reduce the risk of trying to recreate a charging petrol station involved, for want of a better word.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, well, on that note, we're going to move on to our next poll on the note of how people may or may not change their usage, the way they use vehicles. As we move on to the next Mentimeter poll, the results of the first one fairly evenly split. Most of you think that the pandemic accelerated slightly the move towards EVs as people change their use. So our next question we'd like to know is who bears the biggest responsibility for making the transition to EVs happen? Is it car makers and OEMs? Is it government? Is it corporate fleets? Or is it charging companies and infrastructure providers? And which of those will have the biggest influence on customers making the switch to the other side? On the subject of new technology, what are you most excited about? What do you think is coming down the track? Peter, we'll start with you. You touched on sort of wireless charging from it there. What are you most excited about getting people into EVs? What's coming that will make them do it?
I believe wireless charging is going to make a tremendous difference because it's going to have the ease and you're also not going to have to be cabling all the time. And I think from a general perspective, as we move towards a more autonomous vehicle, then it makes logical sense if we're going to reintroduce the car sharing basis, because you'll pick your vehicle up from the spot and it will be fully charged, and when you drive it back, it will charge it before the next person arrives. So I'd like to see more of that. And also, do we look at in-road sort of charging as people drive along? There's a number of areas where that's happening, especially in Sweden. There's a company called Elon Road that actually put the track down the road, which buses are using, and as the bus goes over it, it charges, but then it shuts off the power as the bus has gone through. That will make a massive difference to people engaging EV.
Heiko, you're involved in new tech and pushing new tech. What excites you? What excites you in that is coming soon that you think will really turn people onto EVs who are not yet?
Yeah, I think what will make a difference and will change things a bit around is, of course, if you have the capability of charging with high power. I mean, we started with basically what comes out of the socket. If you go to 11 and then 22 kilowatt, we're talking now 50, 100, 150, 200 kilowatt in charging power, and this will make a difference. If we talk about a game changer earlier, that might be the one, because it will bring down your charging time quite a bit. If you travel and the car is not parked anywhere over a couple of hours where you can afford going maybe down to 11 kilowatt charging, if you need to take a break somewhere on the on your travel, on your journey, you don't want to sit there half hour on the charging spot. So this will certainly happen. We looked at wireless charging at Bosch quite a bit, basically 10 years. We invested in that technology. Our thoughts at the end, we stopped the development there because we didn't see OEMs taking that technology into their systems. There is a couple of hurdles there. I don't want to get too deep into those, but we have at least made our homework there. I think that what will happen is once you drive an EV, a plug-in hybrid, you will just get used to take that cable out, like I said earlier, and put it back in your car. It will be like putting a seatbelt on at one point, and then it will be acceptable for the end consumer to do so.
On infrastructure, while you're on, Heiko, we've got a few questions from the audience. Adam Collin from Australia writes to say, what about one of the big issues for consumers in Australia is the lack of range when the country is so vast and the distances are so vast. Harsha Okin writes from India saying, what about countries like India where the charging infrastructure is very low and underdeveloped? Is there anything that can be done, or what can be done to, I mean, sometimes we get a bit complacent. We think that EVs are coming. It's easy for us. We live in Western Europe, and it's, you know, we see it everywhere. In places where it is not yet so common, will they be a long way behind us? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, there are regional different challenges. I like the idea of Australia coming in now and saying like, hey, I'm used to drive huge distances with my combustion engine vehicle. If you do that frequently and often, and it's not a journey that you take once a year maybe, where you can go through the challenge of finding an infrastructure that carries you there, then I would say the solution is still a combustion engine vehicle, or a plug-in hybrid. And we will see, as I said earlier, we'll see those on the road. Some might even run with synthetic fuel. At the end, you're going to be CO2 neutral by using synthetic or e-fuels, as we say here. And that might be a solution for that consumer. However, if you look at the statistics, people tend, and it depends on the region, drive between 30 and 50 miles a day at most. And that's their day-to-day commute, and driving to areas where they maybe do leisure sports or something. And this electromobility can already deliver today. So for Australia, maybe one hint there. We looked at North America quite a bit. I lived myself there for 12 years. I would have put a bet out that electric vehicle will be not a solution for North America because the distances may be comparable to Australia. And so now see wonder, the US maybe push through Tesla, but all other companies also bringing their EVs on the road there. The end consumer is starting to use BEVs for their daily drives and is using it on the road, and even though the distances are far. So I think at the end it is a mindset thing. Maybe North American, US people are early adopters and trying it out, and hopefully they have a good experience at the end. I have been very surprised that plug-in hybrids are not taking off as much in North America and in the US, because I thought always that would have been the great solution there. So I said regionally very different. For India, if the infrastructure, and that's what I said earlier, if the infrastructure is not there, electrification has no chance. It's almost like there would be no gas stations and you sell combustion engine vehicles. If the infrastructure is not capable, there will be no electrification. I'm absolutely sure about that.
Thank you. Yeah, and in the audience, more than half of you seem to agree with that point. What do you think? 54% of you think that government bears the biggest responsibility for making the EV transition happen. Just 16% of you think that it's down to car makers and OEMs. Raj, you've spent time in North America and you spend a lot of time working with an OEM. What is coming down the track that excites you? That what can OEMs do to switch people onto it?
Yeah, so I think the excitement is, I always think from a consumer perspective, you know, coming from 20 years in the industry, we tend to think with engineering minds, but if we think about the consumer perspective, and what becomes more synonymous with electric vehicles are the fun things that we see coming out, right? And it's not necessarily to say that it's because of electrification we see these more fun things appearing in vehicles. When I say fun things, I mean more space inside your vehicle, because actually when you don't have a combustion engine in there, potentially, you don't have a drivetrain going through it, it gives you more opportunity to do some personalization in the vehicle. Fun things through connectivity of your mobile device to the vehicle. So a seamless integration from your music to your personal preferences inside the vehicle, to having complete instrument cluster displays in the cockpit of the vehicle. And some things, again, may not be because of electrification, some are. And the things that are because of electrification is that if you're going to build a vehicle from the ground up, which is not necessarily a powertrain defined platform, but let's say a more software connectivity defined platform, you can, from let's say a greenfield site, tend to start putting more interesting technology into a vehicle. I think that's what's going to excite consumers more, is about what more can I do within my vehicle? What more features and functions and services can I realize through my vehicle? And that for me is probably one of the most exciting parts of the next decade of mobility.
Thank you. Right, that is quite interesting, isn't it? We mentioned cost a couple of times during that, and there is a cost involved with running an internally combusted vehicle, as you will know if you fill one with fuel and you fill out your tax. As we move towards EVs, government revenues from tax and fuel duty will inevitably decrease. Peter, how do you think that circle will be squared, for want of a better phrase? Government revenue will decrease, and at some point they're going to want it back.
Exactly. What do they take per litre of fuel at the moment? Is it 57 pence
It's
plus
about 57
VAT on
pence
top?
plus the VAT on top. Yeah,
So that's a colossal amount of money per fill-up. So where do they get it back? Could it be toll charges across sort of roads where people were able to utilise as charging as well? That's actually really difficult because of the sheer volume of cash that the government make. But the commitment's there. Will there be charging systems or payment systems really by phone so they can lock people into certain elements of where they charge as a spread? But apart from that, you can't really increase the road, in other words, the ability to actually drive it, because they've slashed all those prices down to zero. So they've actually not given themselves a lot of wiggle room, for want of a better word, have they? Yeah. So what's your thoughts, Raj?
No, it's a really big challenge. I think the numbers are around a £40 billion hole that'll be left in the UK budget. So I think there's going to be some innovative ways in which we will continue to use technology, or the government will use technology to raise revenues. Whether it's pay per usage, as you mentioned, through tolls, or whether it's through the charging infrastructure. But there will, by necessity, be some measure of recovery. And the other reason we need that measure of recovery is, if we look back to the poll where we see 57% of people believe that the government is still responsible for making the transition happen, well, then I expect that the government will be looking for some funding to do so. So, don't know the answer just yet, but I think it will be a combination of things. And the digitalization of the vehicle, the digitalization of the infrastructure will be at the heart of it.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think we'll call time on the second poll that we've asked you to answer, which was who bears the biggest responsibility for making the EV transition happen. More than half of you think that is down to government. The next ties is down to charging companies and infrastructure projects. Then car makers and OEMs, and only 4% of you think that corporate fleets have the biggest responsibility for making the change happen. So we'll move on to the third and final Mentimeter poll for the day in a second. And then also, Heiko, you mentioned people earlier in terms of how many people it takes to make an EV and how many people it takes to look after an EV compared to an ICE vehicle. And I want to get your thoughts on that in a second. Our next poll is up first. What's the biggest barrier to EV uptake, do you think? Is it price? Is it range? Is it charging availability? The choice of products? Or something else? And if it's something else, do let us know in the comments panel. But so, Heiko, just back on that people issue, we've got two viewer questions who say, how will servicing and maintenance change for the consumer? Michael Laird sends us that question. And Richard Hughes, following on from that, do you see the number of people involved in service and maintenance decrease in line with your 10-to-1 reduction in the manufacturing side? And this brings issues, doesn't it, for the industry and for employees and for the unions that represent them?
Yeah, I maybe first the Bosch approach. We are looking at the electrification, of course, always with the Bosch approach, and that's meaning we have an ecological responsibility, economic responsibility, and a social responsibility. That's why I brought the employment earlier up, the numbers that might change, the competence, by the way, of those people change. And I like the idea of asking the question now about service. There we don't have numbers yet, so I couldn't scale it for you, but I can already tell you an electric powertrain has much, much less service needs. At the end, the warranty that we currently put on the road foresees that you have no service on an electric axle. That means you can buy the car, run it for 8 to 10 years, put whatever 150,000 kilometers on it, and then maybe even sell it then, and then it has a second life. Currently this changes already on the powertrain side. Now, I'm just giving you a couple of ideas. Brake wear is reducing because most of the energy that you currently use on conventional powertrain systems go into, of course, your brake pillars and in your brake system. Now is recuperated by the electric axle motor that I've showed you earlier. So brake wear is decreasing. What do you want to service on an electric vehicle? I would tend to go Raj's place there. I would say you probably service your software more often, maybe over the air and don't have to go anywhere, than anything else on an electric vehicle, honestly.
Yeah, Raj, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, it's really an interesting point with less parts of service. I guess one area that people will be concerned with is going to be the state of health of the battery. Mm-hmm. Yeah, battery technology is still relatively new if we think about the grand scheme of things versus internal combustion engine, and this is where I think technology will play a big part. Using know-how around battery chemistry, using data that is collected directly from the vehicle itself to think about, how has the battery been performing? What is, maybe where are some faults occurring in the battery? Where can we do some, let's say, preventative diagnostics on the battery? And in turn then, also then condition the battery and use the battery in a certain way so that you can prolong the life of the battery, or even get a certification to the residual life of the battery, which is actually occurring. It's something that we currently do through a service called Battery in the Cloud, where we can provide that certification to the user. So, I think some of these elements of knowing that the battery is going to give you what it wants over a longer period of time, that you can predict its life, and then also when you get to the charging position, to know for the charger itself, to know what is the best way to recharge the battery. Can I go faster because the health of the battery is good, or do I need to slow it down? And I think all of this can be done through the software that Heiko can mention. But and a lot of this, I think, will become quite remote how we handle that.
Well, from your response on the Mentimeter poll, what's the biggest barrier to EV uptake? Battery status doesn't seem to register very highly. So 38% of you think that price is the biggest factor. 14% only think that range is the problem. Charging availability is slightly linked to that. 39% of you think that that is a huge factor as well. Choice of products doesn't seem to be an issue. I mean, there is loads of choice, isn't there? And 2% think that that is something else. Peter, price is interesting, isn't it? Because there is the initial purchase price, and batteries and battery electric vehicles, if you look at the sticker price, can look quite high. But when you look at overall, if we're talking about service costs, if we're looking at refueling costs, if you can charge at home, there can be an offset, can't there?
There can, but also the one thing that we're not taking into consideration is the fact that you can actually push the power back to the grid more expensively than you actually paid for it if you utilise the charging system correctly. Because the grid needs power at a certain time. It's probably at a certain time now, with the change in the way we're all working, where you may not be using the car. So you could have actually charged it much cheaper in the middle of the night or overnight, which however method of charging, and you sell it to the grid when the grid needs it. It's slightly off question, but when you look at the servicing aspect as being reduced, you're looking at the potential cost of build is being reduced, and then on the bonus, you can actually push back and get your power cheaper than you're pushing it back out to the mat. It's very much a sort of win-win to have one. I think the challenge is that most of the vehicles that we currently have that are giving us all the performance and they're giving us the range, like the Teslas and everything else, the biggest challenge is they're not open to everybody, and we need to get the mass of everybody that can't afford to also buy a Tesla. So do we look at a smaller electric vehicle that people are using more, and then the opportunity to, if necessary, share or rent the bigger one for the small times that you do use your larger journeys? Is that a sort of a vehicle as a service or mobility as a service option that could move us forward?
Heiko, is battery tech moving on? What is the next thing for battery production, do you think? And is cost of it coming down? Do you recognise that it's a big factor at the moment?
First of all, I'm surprised about this last poll. The range was playing less a role in this EV, hurdle. I have to just comment on that real quick, because I'm going to my wife. She's North American. If she goes in the car and there's a quarter of tank in the car, she's getting nervous because she knows she has 250 kilometers, roughly 160 miles under her belt. Most of the EVs is what they can put out and what the battery can do from its battery size. So I wouldn't underestimate that range. Will still play a huge role for the next couple of years until we get used to driving EVs and know how to charge them. But to your question, as I said, battery technology, energy storage technology has been doing an awesome job the last 10 years. From where we came from, almost triple the price per kilowatt hour installed, to where we are now. Technology has moved greatly forward. It's also from the material that's being used in batteries, much more efficient now, more efficiently produced. I think the big companies that produce the cells, the lithium-ion cells, are in a race, and this is good, and they will move forward. But at one point, we will of course hit the material price what you limit, and then we cannot do a huge leap forward if we change that battery technology overall. And as you heard from solid-state batteries, companies are working on these new technologies, then we probably could do a next step into lowering the price. From a technology perspective, battery have become much better now, useful. Think of the temperature range. We had the lithium-ion problems technology going 10 years back with very cold temperatures, very hot temperatures. This is all not really a challenge anymore. So I think the battery and energy storage producers are having done a great job.
Thanks. Yes, Dave Hudson writes in to say that smaller vehicles in larger numbers will make the most difference to the planet. We can't allow EV ownership to remain an elite privilege, which is where it comes to the pricing issue up there. Are you surprised, Raj, as well, by the fact that 15%, which is a pretty low, a low amount, I would have thought, think that range is the biggest barrier to EV uptake? I mean, the thing about the car is you will go left and go to work in your normal route, but you could go right and drive to the north of Scotland if you really wanted to. You know, that's the joy of personal travel. Are you surprised that range is not a bigger factor?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And maybe it comes back to the previous point that came up about what impact has COVID had. I don't know if this is really a COVID impact where people are not going too far these days. If you're going somewhere, you're maybe walking to the shops or going very locally, and maybe that's just the current mindset that I'm not traveling so far, so maybe range is not my biggest concern. I've not been to see family, you know, for a long period of time, or driving up and down the M1 or the M40 here in the UK. So it's an interesting phenomena. I mean, it'd be interesting to see that again, let's say, as we come out of COVID, and to assess whether that is still the case.
Yeah, it will be interesting, won't it, to readdress at another time. So, Brill, thank you for that, Raj. And that brings us pretty much to the end of our time today, but you will be able to see this entire webinar on the Leaders Live channel in future, and all of the social outputs. I want to thank all of our panelists with me, Rajesh Darji and Peter Wooding, and from Germany, Heiko Weller. Thank you very much. But also want to thank you from wherever you are for joining us this morning, and don't forget you can catch this at any time in perpetuity online, and we'll see you next time.